Every night at exactly 11 p.m., the people of Cedar Grove would see the orange glow coming from the library windows. By morning, ashes would be scattered in the yard behind the building, and another dozen books would be missing from the shelves. The townspeople called Margaret Whitmore a madwoman, a book burner who was destroying their only source of knowledge and culture. But when they finally discovered what she was really burning, they realized she hadn't been destroying books at all. She'd been destroying evidence of the most horrific crime ring in frontier history. Margaret Whitmore had been the heart and soul of Cedar Grove's intellectual life for 12 years before the burning began. She had arrived in the Colorado Territory town in 1871, a young woman with dreams of bringing education and culture to the frontier. At 28, Margaret possessed something rare in the American West, a formal education from one of the finest women's colleges in Massachusetts, combined with an unshakable belief that books could transform lives and communities. The library that Margaret established in an abandoned mercantile building on Main Street quickly became the pride of Cedar Grove. Through careful correspondence with publishers in New York and Boston, personal donations from her modest salary, and fundraising efforts that brought the entire community together, she had assembled a collection of over 2,000 volumes. Poetry, philosophy, science, literature, history. Margaret's library offered residents access to knowledge that would have been impossible to find anywhere else within 300 miles. What made Margaret special wasn't just her dedication to books, but her genuine love for the people who read them. She spent countless hours teaching adult immigrants to read English, helping children with their school lessons, and organizing reading circles where townspeople could discuss literature and current events. Her library wasn't just a repository of books. It was a gathering place where ideas flourished and communities were built around shared learning. The children of Cedar Grove adored Margaret. She would read stories aloud with dramatic flair, creating voices for different characters and acting out scenes that brought fairy tales and adventures to life. Parents often found their children lingering at the library long after closing time, reluctant to leave the magical world that Margaret had created for them. She remembered every child's reading preferences, carefully selecting books that would challenge them while nurturing their love of learning. Margaret's personal life was quiet but fulfilling. She lived in a small apartment above the library, surrounded by her favorite books and a collection of letters from authors and educators who had become friends through their shared correspondence. She had never married, choosing instead to dedicate her life to the mission of bringing literacy and learning to the frontier. Her friends often teased her about being married to her books, and Margaret would laugh and say that she couldn't imagine a more faithful or rewarding relationship. But in the autumn of 1883, everything changed. It began with a stranger's visit, a well-dressed man who claimed to be a traveling book dealer from Denver. He arrived with a wagon full of leather-bound volumes, offering to sell Margaret rare editions and specialized texts that would enhance her collection. The prices were surprisingly reasonable, almost too good to be true, and the quality of the bindings was exceptional. The dealer, who introduced himself as Mr. Harrison, was persuasive and knowledgeable. He spoke eloquently about literature and education, seeming to share Margaret's passion for bringing books to underserved communities. He claimed to represent a philanthropic organization that subsidized book distribution to frontier libraries, which explained the unusually low prices. Margaret's excitement at the prospect of adding such valuable volumes to her collection overcame any suspicion she might have had about the generous offer. Harrison's first delivery included 50 volumes of what appeared to be classic literature, scientific texts, and historical works. The books were beautifully bound in rich leather with gold lettering, and they looked like they belonged in the finest libraries of the East Coast. Margaret was thrilled to add them to her collection, and she immediately began cataloging them and making them available to the public. But as weeks passed, Margaret began to notice strange things about Harrison's books. Readers would start certain volumes and never finished them, claiming the content was odd or disturbing. Children who picked up what appeared to be adventure stories would quickly lose interest and return the books with confused expressions. Most troubling of all, parents began asking Margaret if she had read the books she was recommending, because their children were coming home with questions about things that seemed inappropriate for young minds. Margaret's investigation into these complaints led to a discovery that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The books weren't what they appear to be. Hidden beneath innocent-looking covers and title pages were documents that made her blood run cold. Detailed records of child trafficking operations, coded correspondence between criminal networks, and lists of children who had been bought and sold like livestock across the American frontier. The book dealer, Mr. Harrison, was actually the coordinator of a vast criminal enterprise that used Margaret's library as a distribution center for their operational documents. The beautiful leather bindings concealed horrors that Margaret could barely comprehend. Auction records for children as young as 5 years old, transportation schedules for moving kidnapped victims between territories, and financial accounts that treated human lives as mere commodities. Margaret realized that she had unknowingly become a crucial link in a network that was destroying the lives of countless children. Her trusted library, the place she had created as a sanctuary of learning and safety, had been transformed into a hub for the most evil trade imaginable. The weight of this knowledge was crushing, but Margaret knew she had to act, even if it meant destroying everything she had worked so hard to build. The decision to burn the books was the most difficult choice Margaret had ever made. Each volume represented years of effort, personal sacrifice, and community support. But as she read more of the hidden documents, she understood that preserving this evidence could save children who were still alive and prevent future victims from suffering the same fate. The knowledge contained in those false books was too dangerous to exist, and burning them was the only way to ensure it couldn't be used to harm more innocent children. Margaret's first night of burning was agonizing. She waited until the town was asleep, then carried the contaminated volumes to the small courtyard behind the library. As the flames consumed the beautiful leather bindings and revealed the true nature of their contents, Margaret wept for the children whose suffering was documented in those pages. But she also felt a grim satisfaction knowing that each page she destroyed was a blow against the network that had used her library for their evil purposes. The physical act of burning books went against everything Margaret believed in, but she forced herself to continue night after night. She developed a system for identifying which volumes contained criminal documents by carefully examining their construction and content. The false books were slightly different from authentic texts. Their bindings were too perfect, their paper was of inconsistent quality, and their content often contained subtle codes and references that made no sense in legitimate literature. As Margaret's nightly fires continued, the people of Cedar Grove began to notice. The orange glow from the library courtyard was visible from several houses, and the smell of burning paper permeated the neighborhood. Initially, residents assumed Margaret was simply disposing of damaged books or clearing space for new acquisitions. But as the burning continued night after night, and as people noticed that perfectly good books were disappearing from the shelves, concern turned to alarm. The first confrontation came from Mrs. Eleanor Hayes, a prominent member of the town council who had been one of the library's strongest supporters. She arrived at Margaret's door on a Tuesday morning, demanding an explanation for the mysterious fires and missing books. Margaret's attempts to deflect the questions only increased Mrs. Hayes' suspicions, and soon the entire town was buzzing with rumors about their librarian's strange behavior. Margaret knew she couldn't reveal the truth about what she had discovered without putting herself and potentially others in danger. Harrison and his associates were clearly ruthless criminals who wouldn't hesitate to eliminate anyone who threatened their operation. If Margaret exposed their use of the library, they might simply move their distribution center elsewhere and continue their horrific trade. Worse yet, they might retaliate against Margaret or the townspeople who had unknowingly supported their activities. The isolation Margaret felt during this period was overwhelming. She couldn't share her burden with anyone, couldn't explain her actions, and couldn't seek help from local authorities who might not understand the scope and complexity of the criminal network. Every day, she had to maintain her role as the town's beloved librarian while secretly working to destroy evidence of crimes that made her sick to her stomach. Margaret's careful examination of the false books revealed the staggering scope of the trafficking operation. The documents showed that children were being systematically kidnapped from orphanages, immigrant communities, and isolated farming families across multiple territories. They were then transported along established routes that connected to railroad lines, mining camps, and remote ranches where they disappeared into lives of slavery and abuse. The financial records hidden in the books showed that this wasn't a small-scale criminal enterprise, but a sophisticated business operation that generated enormous profits for its organizers. Children were categorized by age, physical characteristics, and skills, then sold to buyers who had specific requirements for their illegal labor forces. The cold, business-like language used to describe these transactions was perhaps the most chilling aspect of what Margaret discovered. Most heartbreaking of all were the personal details about individual children that appeared throughout the documents. Names, ages, descriptions of their families, and notes about their personalities and abilities were recorded alongside information about their sales and destinations. Margaret read about children who had been torn from loving families, others who had been promised jobs or education only to be sold into slavery, and some who had simply vanished from the streets of frontier towns without anyone noticing their disappearance. As Margaret continued her investigation, she began to understand how the network operated and why her library had been chosen as a distribution point. Cedar Grove's location on a major stagecoach route made it an ideal place for transferring documents and coordinating activities across the territory. The library's reputation as a respectable community institution provided perfect cover for meetings and document exchanges that would have appeared suspicious in other settings. Harrison's visits to the library weren't random. They were carefully scheduled to coincide with the arrival of other network members who would pose as ordinary travelers or business people visiting the town. These individuals would browse the library's collection, selecting specific volumes that contained the information they needed for their operations. Margaret realized that she had been facilitating these exchanges without ever suspecting their true purpose. The discovery that her library had been used to coordinate child trafficking filled Margaret with guilt and rage. She had dedicated her life to protecting and educating children, only to discover that she had unknowingly helped criminals who preyed on the most vulnerable members of society. The betrayal of her trust and the corruption of her life's work was almost more than she could bear. But Margaret's guilt was transformed into determination as she realized that her unique position gave her the power to strike back against the network. By destroying their documents, she could disrupt their operations, eliminate evidence of their crimes, and potentially save children who were still at risk. The systematic burning of the false books became Margaret's way of fighting back against evil that had infiltrated her sanctuary. Margaret's methodology for identifying and destroying the criminal documents became increasingly sophisticated over time. She learned to recognize the subtle differences between authentic books and the false volumes that contained criminal records. She developed techniques for safely extracting and copying information that might be useful to law enforcement, while ensuring that the original documents were completely destroyed. The most dangerous aspect of Margaret's secret mission was the risk that Harrison or his associates might discover what she was doing. She had to maintain the appearance of normal library operations while secretly investigating and destroying their documents. This required careful timing, elaborate deceptions, and constant vigilance to avoid detection by criminals who wouldn't hesitate to eliminate anyone who threatened their operation. Margaret's nightly burning ritual became a form of therapy as much as a practical necessity. Each flame that consumed another page of criminal documentation felt like a small victory against the forces that had corrupted her library and threatened innocent children. The physical act of destruction was cathartic, allowing her to channel her anger and guilt into concrete action against the network that had used her dedication to learning for such evil purposes. As months passed, Margaret began to see the effects of her campaign. Harrison's visits became less frequent, and when he did appear, he seemed agitated and suspicious. Other members of the network stopped visiting the library entirely, suggesting that their document distribution system was being disrupted. Margaret allowed herself to hope that her actions were having a real impact on the criminal organization's ability to operate effectively. But Margaret's secret war against the trafficking network was taking a severe toll on her physical and emotional health. The stress of maintaining her deception, the horror of what she had discovered, and the isolation of being unable to share her burden with anyone were wearing her down. She lost weight, developed insomnia, and found it increasingly difficult to concentrate on her normal library duties. The townspeople's growing suspicions about Margaret's behavior added another layer of stress to her already overwhelming situation. Their confrontations became more frequent and more hostile as they struggled to understand why their beloved librarian was destroying the books they had worked so hard to collect. Margaret's attempts to deflect their questions without revealing the truth became increasingly strained and unconvincing. The crisis that would ultimately expose Margaret's secret activities began when a group of concerned citizens decided to take action to stop what they perceived as their librarian's destructive madness. Led by Mrs. Hayes and several other prominent community members, they organized an intervention that would force Margaret to explain her actions or face removal from her position. On the night of the planned intervention, Margaret was in the courtyard behind the library, feeding another batch of false books into her carefully maintained fire. She had become so focused on her work that she didn't notice the group of townspeople approaching until it was too late to hide what she was doing. When they rounded the corner and saw her standing beside a pile of burning books, their worst fears about her mental state seemed to be confirmed. The confrontation that followed was intense and emotional. Mrs. Hayes and the others demanded that Margaret explain why she was destroying the library's collection, accusing her of betraying the trust the community had placed in her. Margaret's attempts to deflect their questions without revealing the truth about the trafficking network only seemed to confirm their suspicions that she had suffered some kind of mental breakdown. As the argument escalated, Margaret realized that she could no longer maintain her deception. The townspeople deserved to know why she had been forced to take such drastic action, even if revealing the truth put her in danger. With tears streaming down her face, Margaret began to explain what she had discovered hidden within the beautiful books that Harrison had sold to the library. The revelation that their trusted library had been used as a distribution center for child trafficking documents shocked the townspeople into silence. As Margaret showed them examples of the false books and explained how the criminal network had operated, their anger toward her transformed into horror at the evil that had infiltrated their community. The books they had accused her of destroying in madness were revealed to be evidence of crimes so terrible that burning them seemed like the only appropriate response. Mrs. Hayes, who had been Margaret's harshest critic, broke down in tears as she realized the burden that their librarian had been carrying alone for months. The community members who had gathered to confront Margaret about her destructive behavior found themselves facing the reality that she had been the only thing standing between their children and a network of criminals who viewed young lives as merchandise to be bought and sold. Margaret's revelation about the trafficking network's use of the library sparked immediate action from the community. The townspeople organized search parties to look for any remaining false books, contacted territorial authorities, to report the criminal activities and began investigating other businesses and individuals who might have been involved in the network. The discovery that such evil had operated in their midst galvanized Cedar Grove into a collective effort to ensure that nothing like it could happen again. The investigation that followed Margaret's revelations led to the arrest of Harrison and several other members of the trafficking network. The information that Margaret had carefully preserved while destroying the operational documents provided law enforcement with crucial evidence about the scope and methods of the criminal organization. Her courageous decision to act alone against such dangerous criminals had ultimately led to the disruption of a network that had been responsible for the suffering of countless children. Margaret's story spread throughout the territory as news of the trafficking network, and her role in exposing it became public knowledge. She was hailed as a hero who had sacrificed her life's work to protect innocent children. But Margaret herself struggled with the recognition. She felt that her initial unwitting cooperation with the criminals made her complicit in their crimes, even though she had ultimately been the one to bring them down. The aftermath of the scandal transformed both Margaret and the community of Cedar Grove. The library was rebuilt with new security measures and procedures designed to prevent its exploitation by criminal organizations. Margaret continued her work as librarian, but with a deeper understanding of how evil could hide behind facades of respectability and legitimate business. The children whose lives had been saved by Margaret's actions never knew her name or the sacrifice she had made on their behalf. But somewhere in the territory, young people who might have disappeared into lives of slavery and abuse were able to grow up free, because one librarian had chosen to destroy books in order to save lives. Margaret found meaning in that knowledge, even as she struggled with the memories of what she had discovered hidden within the volumes she had burned. The false books that Margaret destroyed contained evidence of a criminal network that extended far beyond Cedar Grove and Harrison's immediate associates. Federal investigators who examined the preserved documents discovered connections to similar operations in other territories, leading to additional arrests and the rescue of children who were still being held by traffickers. Margaret's decision to carefully document and preserve crucial information while destroying operational materials had maximized the impact of her actions on the broader criminal enterprise. Years later, when Margaret was asked about her decision to burn books, an act that went against everything she had been trained to believe about preserving knowledge, she would explain that some information was too dangerous to preserve. The knowledge contained in those false volumes wasn't wisdom or culture. It was a tool for evil that had no place in a civilized society. By destroying it, she had chosen to protect future generations from the horrors that such information could enable. Margaret Whitmore died in 1923, 40 years after her secret war against the child trafficking network. Her funeral was attended by hundreds of people, including many who had been children during the events of 1883 and who credited their safety to her courage. The inscription on her gravestone, chosen by the people of Cedar Grove, reads simply, "She destroyed books to save lives, and in doing so, she preserved what mattered most." The library that Margaret had built, burned, and rebuilt became a symbol of the complex moral choices that sometimes face those who dedicate their lives to serving others. Her story reminded future generations that true wisdom sometimes requires the courage to destroy what appears valuable in order to protect what is truly precious. In a world where evil often hides behind facades of respectability and legitimate purpose, Margaret Whitmore's example showed that ordinary people could make extraordinary differences when they chose to act with courage and moral clarity. The books that Margaret burned were not really books at all. They were weapons disguised as literature, tools of evil masquerading as instruments of learning. By recognizing them for what they truly were and having the courage to destroy them, she had protected not just the children of her time, but future generations who might have fallen victim to similar schemes. Her legacy lived on in every child who grew up free because one librarian had chosen to fight evil, even when that fight required her to destroy everything she appeared to love. If you're enjoying these incredible true stories of hidden heroism and moral courage, hit that subscribe button because we've got many more tales of ordinary people who accomplished extraordinary things waiting for you. Click on the video on your screen to hear another story about someone who discovered that sometimes the greatest act of preservation requires the courage to destroy, proving that true wisdom lies not in what we keep, but in what we choose to protect.